In this video, we will show you how to replace your VVT solenoid on this GMC Acadia with a 3.6 liter engine. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Something to mention real quick is you're going to have two intake VVT solenoids and two exhaust VVT solenoids. You have one of each for each bank on your vehicle. Bank 1 is over here, and bank 2 would be located along the front side of the vehicle. And for each bank, the process is the same for either of the VVT solenoids, but you definitely do not want to mix them up. So let's get started with bank 1. Once that's complete, we'll move to bank 2. We're going to make our way along the back passenger side of the engine. The VVT solenoid is going to be located underneath this foam panel. It's an insulator. We have to remove this so we can gain access. There's going to be several things that we have to pay attention to so we can get this panel out of the way. We have a couple of electrical connectors. For each one of these electrical connectors, they have a small red locking tab. Use a pocket screwdriver. Slide the red locking tab out of the way and remove the electrical connector. A quick inspection for corrosion, and you can set that wiring harness aside. Pay attention to the markings on each one of the wiring harnesses. On my application, I have orange on one of my wiring harnesses, and the rear one is blue. When we go to install this, we need to make sure they're in the proper orientation. Let's repeat the process for this next one. A quick inspection. We'll set this aside. Moving from those wiring harnesses, it's time to disconnect this tube. Along the bottom where it connects onto the valve cover, there's a small white tab. You can see it right here. You just want to press it right in, and you should be able to slide it up and off of there. Now we'll just go ahead and set this aside a little bit. You should be able to pivot it as needed. Now we'll continue on to dislodging these two wiring harnesses from the valve cover. To dislodge these, you can use your hands, a small prying device, or even a trim tool, whatever works best for you. At this point, we're going to start lifting up on the foam insulator. We don't have to fully remove it from the engine, but we do need to lift it up high enough that we can gain access to the VVT solenoid right down in here. To hold it up while we continue, you can use pretty much anything for a spacer. I'm just going to use a small chunk of wood. Before we start removing our VVT solenoid, it's always important to make sure you clean the mounting area prior to removal so no miscellaneous debris falls in the engine. A quick note about your VVT solenoids. You can see that you have two of them right next to each other. The VVT solenoid that's closest to your air intake, which would be essentially the center of your engine, is the intake side solenoid, and the one that's on the outside here is the exhaust VVT solenoid. Let's start removing the intake VVT solenoid. We'll use our 10mm for this. Now we'll take hold of the VVT solenoid, carefully give it a little wiggle, and lift it up and out of the valve cover. Keep in mind, this could have oil on it. There it is, friend. Before you install your intake VVT solenoid, it's always a good idea to clean and inspect the seal. This one looks fine. It's time to install our intake side VVT solenoid. We'll take this and carefully slide it into position. If you need to lubricate it, use some clean motor oil. Align your mounting bolt hole. We'll start on the mounting bolt, snug it up, and torque it to 89 inch-pounds. And now let's repeat the process for bank 1, exhaust side VVT solenoid. Use our 10mm to remove the mounting nut. At this point, we'll take hold of this, pivot it if needed, and lift it up and out of place. this around. Lift that up and out. There it is, friend. Now that we have that out of there, the next thing you need to do is clean and inspect the mounting area and seal. Now we can install our exhaust side VVT solenoid. We're going to take this and carefully slide it into place. It's a good idea to lubricate the O-ring with some clean motor oil. We'll slide that down into position, align the mounting bolt hole. We'll start on the mounting bolt, snug it up, and torque it to 89 inch-pounds. A quick inspection in this area before we continue. Assuming everything's good, let's go ahead and reinstall the insulator pad. We'll remove our spacer, press this down into the proper positioning here. It should sit on there fairly firmly. Now we can start resecuring our wiring harnesses across the back of the valve cover. Just press those right on in there. If your clips had broken, it's a good idea to make sure everything's mounted properly and securely. Use a wire tie if necessary. We'll continue on with our electrical connectors. As I mentioned before, we want to make sure they're in the proper positioning. Press it in, listen for a click, give it a light tug to make sure it's secured in place, and lock it in with the red lock. We'll press that all the way in. One last check on that one, and we can continue on to the intake side VVT solenoid. We'll press that right in here. You can hear an audible click, a light tug, lock it down. Now it's time to resecure this tube. We're going to take it, press it down, listen for a click. Give it a tug. It should move up and down a little bit, but not pull up and off of there. If it does, the clip isn't locked in properly. Okay, we've finished bank 1. Let's move along to bank 2. The first thing we need to do is make sure we remove as much of the debris from along the top of the engine as possible here. I'm going to use some compressed air. We don't want any miscellaneous things to fall inside of the engine in any way. With the area cleaned down as well as possible, we can continue on with removing our air inlet tube. That's going to be located in between the air filter housing here and your throttle body assembly. To start removing this, we'll start with the clamps. You're going to have 2 of them. One here, one right there. We'll use an 8mm or a flathead screwdriver to loosen these. Moving over to the other side along the front of the engine here, we have a 10mm headed mounting bolt to remove. This is a captured bolt. We're essentially loosening it, but it will not come out of place. Making our way back here, go ahead and take hold of this hose. We're going to give it a wiggle and slide it away from its rubber grommet. You can see it sliding out of there. A quick inspection to make sure everything's soft and pliable, not torn, worn, or damaged, and of course this plastic portion isn't damaged. We'll continue making our way towards the passenger side rear here. To disconnect this, it has a locking tab. It's right underneath this area. You just want to carefully press that in, and you should be able to pull this right on out of place. You can use your fingers for this typically. Set that aside. Continuing from here, we're going to lift this up, but we also have to pay attention along this area, separating this tube from our air filter housing and our throttle body. A quick inspection and we'll set that aside. With that out of the way, let's disconnect our throttle body assembly here. On this, you're going to find that you have a gray locking tab. You just want to carefully pull that away, depress the area, and slide this out of place. A quick inspection for corrosion. Now, as we follow the wiring harness down along this intake area, this should be pressed right into this port. Ours is actually broken. During the installation process, I'm going to use a wire tie here. I do always like to make sure wiring harnesses are secured. We'll just temporarily set this aside. Make our way along the front of this area. We're going to disconnect the electrical connector here. This has a red locking tab. We'll use a small pocket screwdriver to pull that out of place. Press on that lock located just behind it. Disconnect it. Now we'll move over this way. Same process. Red locking tab. Now this wiring harness should be pressed down into the intake down in this area. It's very hard to see, but ours is broken as well. Let's move just underneath that. We can start removing this area. This has a white locking tab. You just want to carefully depress that straight down, pull it out of place. Quick inspection there. Make sure your seals are good. We'll follow this tube along the backside. This is held in place with a plastic clip. You can either pry the entire plastic clip up and out, or just continue with your small pocket screwdriver. There's a small ear. You can make your way behind, separate that, and lift that up and out of place as well. Let's continue along the backside here. You're going to find that you have a tube that makes its way across. It's a coolant tube. We're not going to disconnect any of the hoses, but what we do want to do is dislodge it. What you're going to find is you have two 10mm headed bolts holding this in place. Remove the bolts, and then we should be able to shift this line around as needed. Now we can start removing the mounting hardware that's holding this in place. You're going to find that you have 8 13mm headed mounting bolts making their way right along this area, and you'll have one 10mm headed mounting bolt along the front, right down along the throttle body area here. Let's start with the 8 mounting bolts along the backside. 4 of them will be inside of these ports right along the intake cover. Let's get that 10 along the front here. Go ahead and take hold of this. We'll give it a slight wiggle and lift it up and out of place. Make sure nothing falls inside of the engine. With that out of the way, we're going to start cleaning up this area. It's extremely important to make sure that nothing falls inside of any of the 6 ports that lead into your engine. This can cause catastrophic engine damage. I'm going to use a vacuum, clean as much of the debris as possible from around the area, and then I'll protect each one of the ports. At this point, I'm going to take some clean rags, fold them, and gently press them into each of the ports just enough that they'll protect the area, but not fall into the point that we'll forget about them and leave them in during the installation process. Now we can start removing our VVT solenoids. The intake VVT solenoid is the one with the orange marker on it. It's closest to where the center of the engine would be. The exhaust VVT solenoid would be furthest away from where the air intake would be, and it has the blue electrical marker. Let's start disconnecting our electrical connector. We'll start with the red locking tab. After that, you want to depress the locking tab that's also right here. While that's being held down, we'll continue on with sliding this out of place. A quick inspection, of course. Set the wiring aside. Continuing from there, it's time to remove our 10mm mounting bolt. Now we can start removing the VVT solenoid here. Take hold of it. You should be able to pivot it around, and then we can pull it up and out of place. If you have a hard time, gently pry. Just be careful not to cause any damage. This will have oil on it. There it is, friend. Before installation of the intake VVT solenoid, we'll make sure we clean up and inspect the mounting point here. Make sure that rubber seal is still in good condition, still soft and pliable. That feels great. Inspect the mounting bolt port here. That looks good as well. Okay, friend, let's install our Bank 2 intake VVT solenoid. Lubricate the O-ring with clean motor oil, and we'll slide this down and into place. It should press down fairly easily. If you have to force it, something's not properly aligned. Continue on with your 10mm headed mounting bolts. We'll start it in, snug it up, and torque that to 89 inch-pounds. Now it's time for the electrical connector. We'll take this, press it in, listen for a click, a light tug, and then lock it in. And now let's repeat the process for Bank 2 exhaust side VVT solenoid. Using our 10mm here, same as before, same process. There it is, friend. With that solenoid out of place, we'll continue on with cleaning the mounting point, a quick wipe, and a close inspection. Make sure that's soft and pliable, and the mounting port's clear. Now it's time to install our Bank 2 exhaust side VVT solenoid. We'll lubricate the O-ring with clean motor oil and slide it down into place. Start in the mounting bolt by hand, snug it up. We're going to torque that to 89 inch-pounds. Now it's time for our electrical connector. We'll get this in place, press it in, listen for a click. A quick wiggle, lock it in. One last inspection in this area and we can continue on. Now let's clean up the mounting area so we can reinstall our intake. It's important to make sure around each one of the ports where the gaskets that are part of your intake are going to hit up against is a nice smooth surface, clean and free of any miscellaneous raised areas or debris. To do this, you could carefully use a razor blade if needed, but be very careful not to cause any damage. Otherwise, if it just looks like it's a little dirty, we'll use some parts cleaner directly on a rag and give it a quick wipe. Make our way around all these ports. Once again, we're trying to make sure nothing falls inside of the ports here. That can cause catastrophic damage to your engine. After cleaning, let's go ahead and get all these out of here. Keep in mind there's 6 ports. We need to make sure all of them are free and clear. One last quick inspection in this area, and let's have a look at the intake. Looking along the bottom of the intake, you can see those 6 gaskets that fit over the ports that we had just cleaned on the engine. Typically, it's a good idea to replace these, but at minimum, you do want to give them a good cleaning and make sure they're still soft and pliable. While we're cleaning these, make sure nothing falls inside of any of the ports as you continue along. Double check to make sure everything's seated properly as we continue on. Let's get this on the vehicle. Start bringing this in here. We're paying attention to that coolant tube making its way along the backside. That goes above the intake. Once you feel as though you have it in the rested position and everything's properly aligned, continue on to starting in each of your mounting bolts. Do not tighten any of them until every single one of them has been started by hand. Also, before you start snugging these, there is a particular sequence for snugging and torquing. We're going to start right here, first of all. Start it in. Make our way over here. For the first pass here, we're literally just going around and trying to start them in. We want to make sure nothing's cross-threaded in. We do not want to cause any damage. There's those. Now let's start in the forward mounting bolt here. This one's just the 10mm headed bolt. With all 9 of the mounting bolts started in, now we're going to snug them in the same sequence. After they're all snug, torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Torque these. Let's do one more pass, same sequence, same torque. Now let's make our way to the forward mounting bolt. Now I'll just use my ratchet and make sure this is snug. Right there's bottomed out. Double check, make sure your intake system is secured to the top of the engine properly. Now let's get this tube in place. We're just going to bring this over, slide it down into its plastic clip. Now we'll come down along where the valve is, press this in, listen for a click. Once you've heard the click, just go ahead and give it a tug. You should feel it slide a little bit, but definitely not pop right off of there. Once you're sure that's secured, let's go ahead and make our way back to our plastic clip holding this in place. Just going to press that right down on there as hard as possible. Listen for a click, a quick tug as we make our way along. Now it's time for our electrical connector. We're going to take the wiring harness and come in and behind this area. We'll press that on there. lock it in, a little wiggle. This should fit right into that port that I had shown you earlier. Just slides right down and in there. Resecure your MAP sensor wiring harness. Let's make our way along the back side of the intake here. We're going to resecure our coolant tube with our two 10mm headed mounting bolts. Once they're both started in, go ahead and snug them up. Let's connect our electrical connector here. Press it in, listen for a click. We'll give it a light tug to make sure it's secured and lock it in. Now we can install our air intake system here. When we go to put this in position, we want to make sure we align our mounting points. We do have two rubber grommets, and we also have the area for that mounting bolt. When bringing this in position, the rubber grommets will sit on each of these two locating tabs here. The mounting bolt will go into its port, but before we start aligning that, we need to take the tube and get it in place on the air filter housing and the throttle body. Start bringing this down. I'm going to slide it onto the throttle body. When you're sliding it into position, you need to make sure it's completely seated, all the way in the proper position, and then you want to tighten the clamp. Okay, right there is where it wanted to bottom out. We'll just take it a tiny bit further. Double check, make sure that's secured. Same thing for the other clamp. Make sure it's completely bottomed out against your throttle body. Tighten the clamp. Now we can align this. We'll press it in along the back side and install our mounting bolts across the front. Now that it's aligned, I'm going to tap on the back here. That should press it into the proper position. Start in the 10mm bolt by hand and snug it up. Bottomed out, nice and snug. Confirm everything's properly secured. We'll make our way along the back side. Let's get this aligned. Press it in, give it a wiggle, make sure that's properly secured. Continue on towards the passenger side. Okay, friend, we finished the installation of our VVT solenoid. At this point, the next thing you need to do is go ahead and start up the vehicle. Let it run for a short while, make sure you have no misfire, no running condition, no check engine light, and then take your vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.